Night fell over Tallahassee with unusual density. The sky, covered by thick clouds, seemed to hide something beyond the atmosphere, as if time itself were suspended. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida and a central figure in American politics, watched the horizon from his office with restless eyes. In recent months, a series of inexplicable events had unfolded behind the scenes of power, and everything seemed to converge on a single point: an ancient manuscript attributed to Nostradamus, recently discovered in a forgotten crypt beneath the foundations of an abandoned church in Provence. The document, wrapped in aged leather and sealed with alchemical symbols, did not appear in any official catalog. Its contents, written in a mixture of archaic Latin and medieval French, contained predictions that had never been published in the traditional compendiums of the centuries. What made this secret code even more disturbing was the explicit mention of contemporary names, among them that of DeSantis. The prophecy spoke of a lion of the South who would rise in times of chaos, guided by an iron mirror and threatened by shadows from the east. The language was ambiguous, but scholars who had access to the text agreed. Something big was about to happen, and the epicenter would be the United States. DeSantis, initially skeptical, was convinced by a team of cryptographers and historians working in secret for the Department of Defense. They had cross-referenced the verses of the manuscript with historical patterns, astronomical events, and geopolitical cycles. The result was alarming. The prophecy indicated that a war of global proportions was about to break out, and that the governor of Florida would play a decisive role, not as a mere politician, but as a messianic or destructive figure, depending on the choices he made. Meanwhile, in Washington, the White House remained silent on the matter. The president, embroiled in internal and external crises, did not want to fuel conspiracy theories. But in the corridors of the Pentagon, the mood was one of urgency. Satellites had detected unusual movements at military bases in Central Asia, and intelligence reports pointed to a secret alliance between Eastern powers, motivated by something that transcended economic or territorial interests. It was as if they had also read the code, or worse, as if they were trying to fulfill it. DeSantis, pressured by advisors and his own curiosity, decided to travel to France to see the manuscript with his own eyes. The crypt where it was kept was accessible only through a narrow tunnel, lit by torches and protected by guardians who followed ancient traditions. Upon entering the enclosure, the governor felt an inexplicable dizziness. The air seemed charged with electricity, and the symbols on the walls pulsed with a faint light. When he finally touched the parchment, a feeling of déjà vu overwhelmed him, as if he already knew what was written there, as if those words had been engraved on his soul since before his birth. The text spoke of a time of broken mirrors, where truth would be distorted and leaders would be tested by invisible forces. There were mentions of towers of fire, seas of blood, and voices that do not belong to this world. But the most disturbing passage was the one describing the chosen one of the South facing an entity called the Silencer, described as a force that manipulates reality and erases collective memories. Scholars did not know if this was a metaphor for censorship, technological control, or something more sinister. Upon returning to the United States, DeSantis was different, more introspective, more determined. He began to make decisions that surprised allies and adversaries alike. Secret meetings were called, alliances were broken, and a new national security doctrine began to take shape. All this under the pretext of protecting the country from external threats. But the few who knew about the prophecy understood that there was something deeper at stake. The media, as always, speculated. Some spoke of a strategic shift toward isolationism. Others spoke of preparations for armed conflict. But no one knew the truth behind the scenes. Nostradamus' secret code had been activated, and the clock of war had begun its countdown. The question hanging in the air was simple and terrifying. Was DeSantis fulfilling his destiny or trying to change it? The Shadow Council, in the heart of the Pentagon, in a windowless room known only by a number, Room 17, a group of high-ranking officers, intelligence analysts, and historical cryptography experts gathered. Access to that space required more than credentials. It required conviction, absolute silence, and a willingness to face truths that most citizens should never know. Since Ron DeSantis had revealed Nostradamus' manuscript, the Department of Defense had mobilized secret resources to decipher and interpret every line of text, treating it not as superstition, but as a possible strategic threat. General Marcus Ellison, a veteran of 3 wars and current head of the Strategic Intelligence Division, led the meetings with an expression his subordinates knew well, the look of someone who knows something is about to explode. He didn't believe in prophecies, but he believed in patterns, and the patterns emerging from the code were disturbing. The prophecy predicted a rupture between the pillars of the West, a voice that will rise against the empire machines, and an alliance of dragons that will spit fire over the seas. For Ellison, this was not medieval poetry. It was a coded description of imminent geopolitical events. The team of cryptographers had cross-referenced the verses with satellite data, communications intercepts, and global financial movements. The result was a map of tension spreading across specific points: the South China Sea, the border between Ukraine and Russia, the Persian Gulf, and, curiously, the state of Florida. DeSantis' presence in the prophecy was not just symbolic. It seemed to be the trigger. The Lion of the South, as the text called him, would be responsible for a decision that would divide the world between light and darkness. The problem was that no one knew what that decision would be. Meanwhile, in underground bunkers, war simulations were conducted based on the scenarios described by the code. In one, an alliance between China, Russia, and Iran launched a devastating cyber attack against U.S. defense systems, followed by a coordinated military offensive. In another, an internal uprising in the United States, fueled by disinformation and digital manipulation, led to the fragmentation of the country. In all simulations, DeSantis' name appeared as a catalyst, sometimes as a savior, sometimes as a traitor. The Shadow Council, as some informally called the Room 17 group, began to consider extreme measures. One of them was the creation of a protocol called Oracle, which consisted of using advanced artificial intelligence to predict political decisions based on behavior patterns, public speeches, and private interactions. The system, fed by billions of data points, indicated that DeSantis was at a turning point. Any move he made could trigger a chain reaction. The problem was that the governor himself seemed to be acting outside the norm, as if he were being guided by something beyond logic. Confidential reports indicated that DeSantis had met with obscure figures, including a group of Tibetan monks who claimed to have ancestral knowledge of Nostradamus' prophecies. There were also records of meetings with quantum physicists who were studying the possibility of parallel realities and temporal manipulation. For the council, this went beyond the limits of rationality, but it could not be ignored. After all, if the enemy believed in the prophecy, then it became a weapon, regardless of its veracity. On a particularly tense night, Ellison called an emergency meeting. A new section of the code had been deciphered, and it mentioned a specific date, September 21st, 2025. The verse read, "When the equinox touches the blood of the South, the mirror will be broken and silence will be shouted." The interpretation was vague, but the coincidence with military movements in the Pacific and inflammatory speeches by foreign leaders was alarming. The Pentagon decided to activate the highest level of readiness, unofficially, to avoid panic, but operationally, with troops being repositioned and defense systems being recalibrated. Meanwhile, DeSantis remained silent in public. His speeches became more enigmatic, full of metaphors and historical references. In one of them, he said, "We are on the verge of a time when the past and the future will meet, and only those who understand the present will be able to survive." For the analysts in Room 17, this was confirmation that he was acting on the code. The question was he trying to prevent war or accelerate it? The Shadow Council began to consider one last option: neutralizing DeSantis. Not physically, but politically. Create a narrative that would discredit him, remove him from power before he made the decision predicted by the prophecy. But that required a complex operation involving the media, international allies, and manipulation of public opinion. And there was a risk. If DeSantis was really trying to save the country, then his removal could be a fatal mistake. The war, according to the code, would not only be between nations, it would be between realities, between what is and what could have been, and time, as one of the verses said, will no longer be a line, but a broken mirror where each fragment will show a different destiny. The Pentagon, for the first time in its history, was not only facing external enemies, it was facing its own future, the convergence of manuscripts. Ron DeSantis was no longer just the governor of Florida. Ever since he had touched Nostradamus' parchment in the French crypt, something inside him had awakened, an expanded consciousness, a perception that transcended linear time. He couldn't explain it, but he felt he was being guided by invisible forces, as if his every step had already been written somewhere. And it was this feeling that led him to launch a clandestine operation, far from the eyes of the press, Congress, and even his closest political allies. The first step was to gather people who, like him, had come into contact with uncategorized prophetic texts. Through obscure channels, DeSantis reached a group of archaeologists and linguists working on excavations in Iran, where they had found fragments of a codex attributed to a disciple of Zoroaster. The text, written in Avestan, mentioned a war of reflections and a man from the West who will bring the fire of judgment. The similarity to Nostradamus' manuscript was disturbing. Even more so, the name Ronaldus appeared in one of the passages, although scholars insisted that it could be a phonetic coincidence. DeSantis then activated a network of former CIA and MI6 agents, many of whom had been dismissed for unconventional behavior. These were men and women who had encountered inexplicable phenomena during missions in places such as Tibet, Siberia, and the Sahara. One of them, known only as Carter, claimed to have seen an underground temple where priests kept a star map that aligned with Nostradamus' prophecies. Another, a linguist named Amaru, had deciphered a Mayan text that spoke of a time of broken mirrors and a leader from the north will fall before the lion of the south. These discoveries led DeSantis to conclude that the French code was just one piece of a global prophetic system. Each ancient civilization had left clues, fragment of a puzzle that could only be solved when all the texts were brought together. What's more, there was a secret order trying to prevent this convergence. They were called the Silencers, an organization that had been operating since the 17th century, made up of bankers, religious leaders, and military strategists. Their goal was to keep the world in a state of cyclical ignorance, preventing humanity from reaching the moment of revelation. The existence of the Silencers was confirmed by documents found in an abandoned safe in Vienna, belonging to an Austrian count who had been expelled from the church for heresy. The papers revealed secret meetings in which the manipulation of historical events was discussed in order to divert the course of prophecies. The fall of empires, assassinations of leaders, and even pandemics were described as necessary interventions. DeSantis, upon reading this, understood that his mission was not only to decipher the code, it was to prevent it from being erased from history. The secret network he set up began operating on multiple continents. In Africa, a group of historians tracked down an Ethiopian codex that spoke of a red moon over the southern lion. In India, monks revealed a Vedic text that predicted a war between those who see and those who pretend not to see. And in South America, an Amazonian shaman gave DeSantis a stone artifact with inscriptions that, when translated, read, "Time will be bent by the one who bears the name of fire." The connection between all these elements was undeniable and frightening, but not everyone was willing to help. In Berlin, a historian was found dead after revealing that he had deciphered a section of the code that predicted the destruction of a European capital. In Tokyo, a professor disappeared after claiming that Nostradamus' code contained instructions for activating a symbolic time machine, a ritual that would allow access to the collective memories of past civilizations. DeSantis realized that the Silencers were at work, eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. To protect himself, he created a communication system based on quantum encryption, impossible to intercept by conventional means. It used private satellites, camouflage drones, and servers in remote locations. Each member of the network received a part of the code, without knowing the whole, a strategy inspired by the ancient alchemists, who divided knowledge to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. And even so, there were leaks. An independent journalist published an article insinuating that DeSantis was involved in an apocalyptic cult. The text was quickly removed, but not before being replicated in obscure forums. The tension was mounting. Outside, the world went on as usual: elections, economic crises, regional conflicts. But inside, a silent war was unfolding. DeSantis knew that time was running out. The date specified in the code was approaching, and he still hadn't gathered all the manuscripts. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that the code itself was incomplete. There was an eighth part, mentioned in a hidden verse, that could only be revealed by someone who does not belong to this time. This revelation led him to consider a radical hypothesis. What if the code was not just a prophecy, but a plan? A roadmap left by superior intelligences, whether human, divine, or extraterrestrial, to guide humanity at a time of rupture? What if he, Ron DeSantis, was just an executor, a pawn in a cosmic game that transcended any ideology or border? The answer, he knew, was close. But to find it, he would have to face the silencers, decipher the eighth part of the code, and make a decision that would change the course of history. The war was not just between nations. It was between oblivion and revelation. And time, as the code said, will no longer be counted in hours, but in choices. The core of truth. Ron DeSantis knew he was approaching the epicenter of the conspiracy. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with frightening precision, and the names that had once seemed symbolic now had faces, voices, and intentions. The silencers were not just a legend. They were real, organized, and ruthless. And more than that, they were infiltrated at all levels of global power. Central banks, technology corporations, security councils, elite universities, all had representatives who, under a facade of rationality, operated to keep Nostradamus' code buried. The first direct confrontation took place in Geneva during an international conference on cybersecurity. DeSantis, under the pretext of discussing digital protection policies, had gained access to a restricted room where the leaders of an organization called Consortium 12 were meeting. Officially, it was a group of experts in global governance. Unofficially, it was one of the operational arms of silencers. Upon entering the room, accompanied only by two trusted agents, DeSantis felt the weight of the atmosphere. The looks were cold, calculating. No smiles, no courtesy. He wasted no time. He presented a series of documents linking consortium members to intellectual sabotage operations, the disappearance of manuscripts, the murder of historians, the manipulation of astronomical data. One of the members, a technology magnate known for funding research in artificial intelligence, tried to divert the subject, claiming that it was all just medieval paranoia. But DeSantis had more. A video, recorded by a drone at a secret facility in Iceland, showed a ritual involving symbols identical to those in Nostradamus' code. At the center of the ceremony, a metal structure pulsed with blue lights, a technology that did not appear in any official records. This structure, called the core by the silencers, was the real secret behind the prophecies. According to documents obtained by DeSantis, the core had been built over 100 years ago, based on instructions found in the Sumerian Codex. It was a temporal resonance machine, capable of accessing vibrational patterns that connected the past, present, and future. It was not a time machine in the classic sense, but an interface between realities. And most disturbingly, it could only be activated by someone who was aligned with the code. DeSantis, upon discovering this, realized that his connection to the manuscript was not just symbolic. He was a catalyst. The Lion of the South was not a metaphor. It was a designation, and the core, if activated by him, could reveal the eighth part of the code, the one that had been hidden by the silencers themselves. But there was a risk. Activation could also trigger a temporal rupture, a kind of collapse of parallel realities. It was as if the world were divided into multiple futures, and the core was the button that would choose which one would become real. The tension between DeSantis and the consortium exploded. One of the members tried to order his arrest, claiming that he was jeopardizing global stability, but the governor had already anticipated this. In less than 5 minutes, his team had hacked into the conference's security systems, broadcasting live to thousands of encrypted channels the images of the core and the documents that proved the existence of silencers. For the first time, the world had a glimpse of what was behind the curtains of power. The reaction was immediate. While some governments demanded explanations, others denied everything, calling the images sophisticated deepfakes. But behind the scenes, The race had begun. Countries began mobilizing their own intelligence networks to locate the core. Religious groups declared that the end of times was near, and in obscure forums, theories emerged by the thousands, some claiming that DeSantis was a savior, others that he was the Antichrist. The governor, for his part, remained focused. He knew that the real challenge was yet to come. The core, according to the documents, was divided into three parts: the physical structure, the activation code, and the human element. He already had access to the structure and the code. The third component was missing, someone who had been mentioned in all the prophecies, but whose identity remained hidden. The guardian of the echo, as he was called, would be the key to stabilizing the activation and preventing the world from plunging into a war of realities. To find it, DeSantis embarked on a new journey. Using symbolic correlation algorithms, he cross-referenced data from ancient texts with genetic records, behavioral patterns, and even dreams reported by people around the world. The search led him to a forgotten village in Patagonia, where an 8-year-old child drew symbols identical to those in the code without ever having seen them. The girl, named Amaru, seemed to have an inexplicable connection to the core. When placed in front of a replica of the structure, the sensors reacted as if they were in front of the real catalyst. But the silencers were not willing to allow the activation to take place. In less than 24 hours, the village was attacked by unidentified drones. DeSantis managed to escape with Amaru, but he understood that time was running out. The war would not be conventional. It would be a war of narratives, of realities, of choices. And the world, as the eighth part of the code, now partially revealed, said, will be divided between those who remember and those who forget. The activation of the core was near, and with it, the final decision: reveal the truth and face chaos, or maintain silence and perpetuate the illusion. DeSantis knew there was no turning back. The code had been broken, and the world, for the first time, was faced with the possibility of choosing its own destiny. The lion's judgment, the observatory in the Andes, was completely silent. The core, now fully activated, pulsed with an energy that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The stars above moved in unusual patterns, as if the sky were trying to align itself with something beyond human comprehension. Ron DeSantis, surrounded by his network of allies and the enigmatic child Amaru, knew that the moment had come. The eighth part of the code had been revealed, and with it, the final dilemma: to choose between fire and memory. The code was clear in its ambiguity. The lion must choose between fire and memory. Fire meant rupture, destruction, restart. Memory meant preservation, continuity, sacrifice. The activation of the core had created a temporal anomaly that expanded like an invisible spiral, touching every corner of the planet. People began to have visions of lives they had not lived. Cities flickered between alternate versions. Reality was collapsing, and the only way to stabilize it was through a choice that required more than courage. It required renunciation. DeSantis, in a trance, was led by Amaru to the center of the core. The structure, now translucent, revealed floating images, memories of ancient civilizations, forgotten wars, futures that never happened. It was as if time was revealing itself in layers, showing everything that was, everything that is, and everything that could be. And at the center of it all, a recurring image, himself in different versions, making decisions that changed the course of history. The child touched his hand and, without saying a word, transferred a vision. DeSantis saw a future where he chose fire. The world was restarted, power structures collapsed, and a new era emerged, free from silencers, but also without memory, without history, without identity. It was a pure world, but empty. In another vision, he chose memory. The world stabilized, the temporal rifts closed, and humanity maintained its trajectory, with all its mistakes, pains, and achievements. But in that future, he disappeared. His existence would be erased, as if he had never existed. The price of memory was personal oblivion. The dilemma was brutal. Choosing fire meant living, leading, shaping the new world. But it would be a world without roots, without a past, without a soul. Choosing memory meant preserving everything: art, science, love, mistakes, but disappearing like a ghost who had fulfilled his mission. DeSantis, for the first time, hesitated, not out of fear, but out of doubt. What was the true purpose of the code? to reveal the truth or to protect the mystery. As he pondered, the silencers launched their final offensive. The unstable version of the core, activated in Norway, began emitting waves of distortion that threatened to collide with the original core. If that happened, the world would be split into multiple simultaneous realities, an existential chaos where each person would live in a different time, unconnected, meaningless. It was the total collapse of linearity. DeSantis knew there was no more time. The choice had to be made. He looked at Amaru, who now floated slightly above the ground, enveloped in a golden aura. The child smiled, as if she already knew the answer. And then, in a simple gesture, DeSantis touched the center of the core and uttered the final words of the code. May memory prevail over fire. May time remember itself. The explosion of light was silent. A wave of energy spread across the planet, touching every human being with an indescribable sensation, as if they had all awakened from a deep sleep. The temporal rifts closed. The alternate versions disappeared. The silencers, deprived of their manipulation, were dissolved in their own contradictions. And the world, for the first time in centuries, breathed in unison. But DeSantis was no longer there. His body, his history, his memory, everything had been erased, not as punishment, but as fulfillment. He had chosen remembrance, and with that, he had sacrificed his own existence so that the world could continue. Amaru, now silent, kept the code in his mind, waiting for the next cycle, the next awakening. In the history books, there was no mention of Ron DeSantis. In speeches, in memoirs, in records, he did not exist. But in dreams and visions, in moments of deep silence, some people felt a presence, a whisper, a force that had guided the world away from the abyss. And the code, now kept secret, waited for the next lion. Because time, as the last line said, is a mirror that never breaks. It just chooses what to reflect. The war of realities. The world was not prepared for the truth. When the images from the core were broadcast, accompanied by documents revealing the existence of silencers and the connection between Nostradamus prophecies and occult technologies, the planet went into shock. Governments demanded explanations. Religious leaders declared that the end times had begun, and the population, torn between panic and disbelief, sought answers in every corner of the internet. But the truth was greater than any narrative. The code had been broken, and time no longer followed a straight line. Ron DeSantis, now considered by many to be the awakener of the code, became the target of coordinated attacks, not just political, but existential. Extremist groups accused him of being an agent of chaos, while others revered him as a modern messiah. Amid the turmoil, he remained focused to protect Amaru, the child who reacted to the core, and prevent the activation from being manipulated by forces that wished to shape reality for their own ends. The silencers, weakened by exposure, retreated to their hidden strongholds. But they were not defeated. In an underground facility in Norway, scientists linked to the organization managed to replicate part of the core structure, creating an unstable version that, according to their calculations, could alter past events through vibrational resonance. The idea was simple and terrifying: to rewrite history, to erase revolutions, manipulate births, eliminate ideas before they even arose. It was absolute control, not only of the present, but of humanity's collective memory itself. Meanwhile, in Washington, the U.S. government faced an unprecedented crisis. The president, pressured by the military and his advisors, declared a global state of emergency. Troops were mobilized, borders were closed, and a new security doctrine was established: the doctrine of time. It provided for preventive action against any attempt at temporal manipulation, including attacks on suspicious facilities and the neutralization of individuals considered prophetic anomalies. DeSantis, ironically, was included on the list, but he was not alone. His secret network, now expanded, included spiritual leaders, renegade scientists, ethical hackers, and even former members of the silencers who had rebelled. Together, they devised a daring plan: to activate the original core in a ceremony that would unite the fragments of the global prophecies, revealing the eighth part of the code and stabilizing reality before it fragmented completely. The location chosen was an old astronomical observatory in the Andes Mountains, where the stars seemed to align with the symbols in the manuscript. The journey there was marked by confrontations. Military drones attempted to intercept the group. Mercenaries hired by the silencers attacked support convoys. In an ambush on the Chilean border, DeSantis was almost killed, saved by Amaru, who, in an inexplicable moment, emitted a wave of energy that disabled the surrounding electronic systems. The group's scientists began to understand that the child was not just a catalyst. He was a point of convergence between realities. His existence defied the laws of physics, and his connection to the code was deeper than anyone had imagined. As the group approached the observatory, the world began to fragment. Reports of time rifts emerged in different parts of the planet. People claimed to have seen alternate versions of themselves. Entire cities experienced time lapses, where hours disappeared or repeated themselves. In London, a man was filmed walking through a solid wall and disappearing. In Mumbai, a child drew a star map that only existed in Sumerian records. Reality was falling apart, and time, as the code said, wept for its lost form. At the observatory, the ceremony began. The fragments of the prophecies were arranged in a circle, and the core was activated with Amaru at its center. The structure pulsed with a golden light, and the symbols began to move as if they were alive. DeSantis, in a trance, recited the verses of the 8th part of the code, revealed by Amaru in a language that no one knew, but that everyone understood. It was as if the language were universal, ancestral, predating humanity itself. The code read, "When time bends before the mirror, the lion must choose between fire and memory. The war will not be between men, but between futures. And only those who do not fear oblivion can guide the world to awakening." With these words, the core emitted a wave of energy that spread across the planet. The temporal rifts began to close. The alternate versions disappeared, and the world, for a brief moment, fell silent. But the war was not over. The silencers at their facility in Norway activated their unstable version of the core. The collision between the two structures created a temporal anomaly that threatened to engulf everything. DeSantis knew there was one last choice to be made, a choice that would determine which reality would prevail. And that choice, according to the code, could only be made by someone willing to sacrifice their own existence. The war of realities had begun, and the world, divided between those who remember and those who forget, awaited the outcome. The guardian of time, the world had fallen silent. After the activation of the core and the sacrifice of Ron DeSantis, reality stabilized like a lake that, after a storm, once again reflects the sky. The temporal rifts disappeared, the echoes of alternate versions dissipated, and humanity awoke with a strange feeling, as if something had changed, though no one knew exactly what. It was like waking up from a deep sleep with blurred memories, but the heart carrying an inexplicable certainty. In the Andes, the observatory was now just ruins. The core structure had disintegrated, leaving behind a circular mark on the ground where vegetation did not grow, but the air seemed to vibrate with subtle frequency. Amaru, the child who had channeled the code, remained there, silent, watching the horizon. She did not age like other children. Her body grew, but her presence remained untouched by time, as if she existed at an intersection between eras. The survivors of the DeSantis network, now scattered around the world, kept in touch through encrypted channels. They did not talk about what had happened, not because they did not want to, but because they knew that the truth could not be told, only felt. In every corner of the planet, subtle signs began to emerge. People dreaming of unknown symbols, children drawing temporal spirals, artists creating works that seemed to echo the code. It was as if DeSantis' memory was scattered in invisible fragments, touching those who were ready to remember. Amaru became a mythical figure. Some called her the guardian of time, others the daughter of the code. She did not speak with words, but with gestures, glances, and presences. Where she passed, time seemed to slow down. People felt peace, clarity, purpose. Scientists tried to study her, but their instruments failed. Religious leaders tried to worship her, but she disappeared. Governments tried to control her, but she became wind. Amaru did not belong to any structure. She was a link between what was and what could be. On a starry night, she reappeared in Tallahassee at DeSantis' former residence. The place had been turned into a silent memorial, although no one knew exactly why. There were no official records of her death, nor of her life, but something pulsed there, an energy that attracted pilgrims, curious people, dreamers. Amaru walked to the center of the garden, where a tree had grown in a spiral shape. She touched the trunk, and for a brief moment, time stood still. Everyone there felt a wave of memory. Images of DeSantis appeared in their minds, not as a politician, but as a traveler, as a guardian, as a sacrifice. They did not know her name, but they knew her gesture. And in that instant, the world understood the real war had not been between nations, but between oblivion and memory. And the victory had been silent, invisible, eternal. Amaru then disappeared again. Some say she has been seen in ancient temples, others that she lives among isolated tribes. There are those who claim that she communicates through dreams, guiding those who are ready to awaken. But no one knows for sure. What is known is that the code remains alive, not in scrolls, but in consciousness. And that time is now guarded by a child who never belonged to this world. The world moved on. Wars diminished. Technologies began to align with ethical principles. Art flourished. Science became more contemplative. And in each advance, there was a trace of the code, a reminder that time is not a line but a choice, and that when the mirror breaks, it is up to us to decide what to reflect. And so ends the saga of Ron DeSantis and the secret code of Nostradamus. The war did not happen as we feared. It was won in silence, in choice, in memory. And the world, now awake, awaits the next cycle. Because time is just beginning.